In July 1996, James Chatters was provided a skull that had washed out from a Columbia River cut bank in the town of Kennewick, Washington. When Chatters first seen the skull, he believed that it was similar to a typical middle-aged Caucasoid male, as it was long with narrow cheeks and a protruding upper jaw. Chatters returned to the site where the skull had been found, and sure enough, more bones were laying about the riverbank. Chatters collected them all and took a series of measurements of the skull and long bones, then framed his preliminary forensic conclusion that the bones were of a Caucasoid male, 40 to 55 years old, at the time of his death, height about 5 feet 9 inches. While thoroughly examining the bones, it was realized that there was some sort of projectile, maybe a bullet, that had penetrated well into the right side of the hip. The man had survived this injury, and the bone had healed over, sealing the object deep inside. A CAT scan showed that it was a stone spear point with a distinctive leaf shape. Chatters believed that he had found a white guy with a stone point in him, but when looking at the badly worn teeth, it was suggestive of a high-grit diet, along with the lack of cavities, suggested that it was Native American's origins. Dogged by the inconsistencies, Chatters sent a scrap of hand bone to a radiocarbon laboratory, and 3 weeks later, the bone sample showed to be 9,200 to 9,500 years old. This made it one of the half-dozen oldest skeletons in the Americas, perhaps the most complete, and Chatters knew that these results spelled big trouble. The reason why this spelled trouble was because Chatters knew that the Native Americans would put claim to the remains for proper burial, and that the scientists were going to want to further investigate the remains, especially as the preliminary findings showed possible Euro-American descent. And this was the beginning of the debate on who had the right to the remains of the Kennewick man. As the age of the remains date back over 9,000 years, there was no question that the remains were of Native American descent, right? But what happens if the remains were of Euro-American descent? Then history as we know it would change, and the rights of the Native Americans would also. I feel that the scientists should not have a right to the remains of the Kennewick man, but they should have the right to perform a thorough and scientific examination of the remains. And if they are proven to be of Native American descent, then they should be rightfully turned over to be properly buried. But if they were of Euro-American descent, then what? Do we rewrite history as we know it? Although there is much that we do not understand about the Ice Age immigrants to the New World, I agree with most of the scholars that the ancestors of Native Americans came from Northeast Asia. This was known as the Clovis First hypothesis, which suggests that the first American arrived sometime during the final part of the Pleistocene. 20,000 years ago, ice blanketed 1/3 of Earth. There were huge ice sheets that covered all of Canada, and it extended across the present Great Lakes into the eastern United States. Monumental glaciers locked up so much water that the world's oceans dropped markedly, exposing a massive unglaciated tract known as the Bering Land Bridge, which connected Siberia to modern Alaska. The Clovis First model holds that the first American walked through this ice-free passageway southward onto the Great Plains. The controversy that surrounds the Clovis First theory is in 1976 when Tom Dillahay, an archaeologist, examined large bones that were found by a team of lumbermen. These bones were identified as Mastodon, an Ice Age elephant. Dillahay looked over the bones for any signs of butchering or other human alteration and found cuts, scrapes, shovel marks, pick fractures, which suggested humans had indeed worked over these bones while they were still green. The site was known as Monte Verde, and in 1977, Dillahay and his Chilean students went on a 3-week exploratory field session where further artifacts, including flaked tools, were found that were believed to show evidence of human activity. Dillahay returned to Monte Verde a year later with an ensemble of specialists to explore the site. The findings showed that the site dates were roughly 12,800 to 12,400 years old, a full 1,500 years more ancient than the oldest known Clovis occupation. Another aspect that needs to be looked into is the past relationship between the U.S. government and the American Indian tribes during the 19th century. The relationship between the two is marked by deceit, violence, and cultural genocide. The policies of the government during this period reveal a concerted attempt to assimilate Indians into Western civilization by encouraging them to give up their traditional ways of life and make way for white settlement. The reason why Native Americans pushed to remain their own identity rather than join the American way was because they considered themselves to be the first humans in the Americas and that the Europeans invaded their land. However, if the remains of the Kennewick man were proven to not be of Native American descent, then it would be looked at that the Native Americans should have adapted the American way as all other immigrants did when arriving to Americas. Indians should have been considered an important part of the American melting pot. Mixed marriages would produce offspring who would intermarry respectable white people, and thus the children would become respectable to the American way. So to recap, I believe that the scientists should have the right to examine the Kennewick man to help determine the exact race, culture of the remains. As if the remains were proven to not be of Native American descent, then the whole course of history, along with the laws that are in effect today, would have to be reconsidered. Also, if the remains of the Kennewick man were proven to not be of Native American descent, then it would be looked at that the Native Americans should have adapted the American way as all other immigrants did when arriving to the Americas. However, if the remains were found to be of Native American descent, then the remains should go to the Native American tribes for proper burial.